Okay, last topic for this lecture is taking a deep dive in how we can actually manage to measure the attitudes that people have in terms of prejudice. So we're now, instead of talking about stereotypical beliefs, let's specifically talk about prejudice, so the attitudes that people might hold based on stereotypes. And to demonstrate why it might be a measurement problem, let me actually just briefly point out to you that actually I really, really like dogs. So I wish I had a dog, and I'm like this close to buying a dog and having a puppy. And now knowing that, I'd like you to imagine that you were in class with me, sitting in front of me in the classroom, and I asked you, do you like or dislike dogs? And you're supposed to answer that question to me. So perhaps it already makes sense to you why I'm pointing this out to you. So I'm talking about a direct measure of attitude. And what I'd like you to do is take this example about me telling you that I really like dogs, but now I want to know if you like dogs. And you're in a position where, I will be grading your exams in the end, right? So I would like you to think about pros and cons of measuring attitudes like this, measuring attitudes in this direct way. When people, in this case, for instance, you, feel like their attitude will actually be observed by someone else, in this case, me, who even has some kind of power over something that's important to them. Not that I would ever make someone's grade dependent on whether they like dogs or not. Of course, that's just a silly example, right? But I'd like you to consider it as an example for discussing why it might be good or bad to measure attitudes in this direct way. So pause the video and come up with some pros and cons of measuring attitudes like this. Okay, so let's discuss. I think the biggest factor speaking in favor of measuring attitude like this is that actually it's quite clear what you're measuring, right? You ask a very simple, direct question, and therefore participants then will give an answer to that question. But they might not only answer that question, but actually the biggest worry that one would have to have is that social desirability plays a role, that participants feel like they can't actually tell you the truth, or they might not feel like they're even motivated enough to tell you the truth, because why should they? It's none of your business what their attitude to dogs is. So there are a bunch of problems with actually asking people directly about their attitudes, and that's why some of the research in social psychology has tried to come up with different ways of measuring attitudes. So how could we measure prejudice and racism and problematic attitudes like this, where no one wants to admit that they have them because they're socially super undesirable? Well, we could try to use implicit measures. What do I mean by implicit measures? I mean using measures that are more subtle than the direct question that I just presented to you, and unobtrusive. And the idea is that these measures rely on uncontrollable automatic reactions. So that our participants in the lab can't override their responses. And we have some like immediate evidence of things like racism and prejudice without it being clouded by social desirability concerns. So how would this be done? Well, there's one procedure that is actually well known for being used in this area, and this is called evaluative priming. The idea here is that participants or people perceive a stimulus, and when they see this stimulus, then evaluative information about this stimulus is activated. So there, if I show you a positive or a negative stimulus, you will evaluate the stimulus, and then the positive versus negative kind of frame of mind will be activated. And thereafter, the speed of evaluating a target stimulus, so not the same that was the input, but a target stimulus, is facilitated by this prime. So information that is consistent is evaluated faster. For instance, if I prime you with the concept of sunshine, positive, and then the target stimulus is wonderful, you will be faster at reacting to wonderful than if the evaluation was inconsistent. And for this, I have an example below. So the inconsistent evaluation would, for instance, be being primed with the word death and then judging the word excellent or wonderful. And there, the target stimulus evaluation would be slower compared to the consistent evaluation. So just to repeat, the idea of evaluative priming is that for consistent evaluations between the prime and the target word, we find faster reaction times and faster evaluations, while the system is slower in responding to inconsistent evaluations between target and prime. So what would this look like? Here is a rendition of how an experiment like this would be put into practice. So participants would first see a blank screen with a fixation cross so that they actually look at the middle. And then we see our first word. This is a prime. This would be our word sunshine. And then we have our target stimulus, which in this case is wonderful, and participants are supposed to press a button whether this is good or bad. And the idea is that wonderful is always good, but if the prime that's shown before, so sunshine, matches the evaluation of the target, so matches wonderful, then it should be faster for participants to respond here than compared to a case where a new trial, they're primed with a negative word, death, which doesn't match the evaluation of the target stimulus, excellent. And the target stimulus, excellent, would always be categorized as good, but it will be done so more slowly than wonderful in the previous trial. Okay, so final note on evaluative priming. It works, the idea is that it works with subliminal primes, so primes that are actually like below the threshold of where you would actually be able to consciously read back to me the word that you just saw, and supraliminal primes, so also primes that you can actually you can read what's going on, and you would be able to tell me what you've just seen. So the question that then comes to mind is actually for individual people, depending on the beliefs that they hold and the attitudes that they have, which primes are consistent for them. So let's take a look at another example, so new trial of our evaluative priming mini experiment. If I prime you with the picture of a black person and then ask you to assess if the word annoying is good or bad, does the evaluation of the prime match that of our target? So is the prime negative or positive? And then does it match the negative evaluation of our target? And we can compare this, the speed of responses to that negative target word annoying, with new trial. Participants' responses when they're primed with the face of a white person, and then thereafter asked to categorize the word irritating. So if you are a racist person, or you hold some negative beliefs at least about black people, you might find the category like being primed with a black person's face activates the concept of negative, and then therefore people might be faster at responding to negative words such as annoying or irritating compared to the condition where they are primed with a white person's face. And this was the premise of the experiment of Fazio et al. That we will discuss here. And here is actually evidence for this experiment like I just showed you. So for now, let's just zoom in on the data for white subjects, for white participants who were either primed with a picture of a white person or a picture of a black person, and then were asked to categorize positive and negative words. And what we have on the y-axis is the reaction time difference compared to trials without pictures. So the difference between prime trials versus trials that are just neutral, where only the positive versus negative words were supposed to be evaluated. So if we take a look at this data, for white people, what we see is that it took them longer compared to baseline to make positive evaluations when they were preceded by a black face compared to a white face. Okay? And it takes longer compared to baseline to make negative evaluations when preceded by a white face compared to a black face. So both these points of data are showing us some types of negative attitudes, right? So both the fact that it takes longer to make a positive evaluation when preceded by a black face, that shows us this negative attitude towards black faces. And the fact that it shows longer compared to baseline to make negative evaluations when preceded by a white face, this again shows us that there's a negative attitude towards black faces. And the data looks a little bit different for black subjects, but you can see that there's also some racial racial bias in the responses here, at least with regard to negative pictures. Okay, so basically the idea would be that we can use these response times and evaluations based on priming to have an implicit measure of whether people hold negative attitudes towards specific groups of people. Variation in the scores, so how big kind of the difference between responding to negative words, for instance, when preceded with black versus white faces. Also, in the study that I showed you before, predicted whether participants would be friendlier to the black experimenter, how they responded to political opinions questionnaires, and it didn't, however, predict participants' explicit opinion. So when they were directly asked explicitly about racism, holding racist beliefs, negative beliefs about black people, then they didn't correlate these overt, open beliefs didn't correlate with our implicit measure. Why? Because you could say it's possible that it didn't correlate because people would be motivated to suppress racism in their open responses, but they might not be able to do so in the implicit measure. But of course, there might also be other reasons why there's no relation between the explicit racism scales and our implicit measure. And it might be that perhaps actually we were measuring maybe not exactly what we think we're measuring with the implicit measure. We don't know for sure. Another implicit measure that can be used to uncover participants' implicit attitudes in questions like racism would be the so-called implicit association test. And this is also a really well-known type of test to unveil participants' attitudes about basically a lot of social categories. But let's for now stick with the example of black versus white people. This implicit association test is a bit of a more complicated procedure compared to the simple idea of evaluative priming that we've seen before. And here the idea is that there are trials where, or like blocks basically, where incongruent categories and congruent categories are presented. So let me walk you through it. So there are 7 blocks or 7 tasks. And the first task would look like this, that participants are supposed to categorize or like respond whether a specific name that's shown is belongs to a white or a black person, is more likely to belong in those categories. So in the example, the name would be Elia, and this would be typically categorized as a black person's first name. Second task, we get data about how participants rate the pleasantness, or like categorize words based on their pleasantness. So for instance, we get the word suffering, and participants are supposed to say if this is a pleasant or an unpleasant thing. And many people would say unpleasant. Okay, and then we get to the incongruent trials, where the target word that's presented, in this case that's happiness, is supposed to be categorized into the categories either black and pleasant or white and unpleasant. And it should be categorized in the pleasant option, right? But because the racist belief that black people are unpleasant, or there's a negative stereotype associated with them, that would be an incongruent category. And then this kind of idea, these incongruent categories, that we have two tasks for that, two blocks. Then we have another block where there's only the target that's supposed to be allocated to either the black or white category. And then we go for the congruent trials, where two blocks are shown where there is a word, in this case first name, that's supposed to be categorized in the congruent category. So that would be white pleasant. The idea here is that being white comes with a positive association. And black unpleasant and Chinese should then be categorized in the black category. That also comes with unpleasant. So overall, we have our 7 blocks, or 7 tasks in this idea. And what I'd like you to do now is to actually try it out yourself, so that instead of me giving you this kind of complicated description of what the design of an implicit association test looks like, I'd like you to go through it yourself. So I'm going to post this link here so that you can click it. And I would ask you to go ahead and take one of the implicit association tests yourself on the internet. So please pause the video now and go try it. Okay, so the idea of the IAT then is that what we would see would be a so-called implicit racism indicator, or we can also call this the IAT effect. And the idea is that it's easier to pair white names with positive words for most people, presumably because white and positive and black and negative are conceptually associated. So the idea also here relies on differences in response times, and so it would be, people would be faster at allocating white names with white and easier to pair white names with positive words than black names with positive words. The IAT is commonly used in social cognition and also outside of this field. So for instance, in marketing, political psychology, forensic psychology, there are many applications for where the IAT is used. And what you can basically do is you can test any associations between concepts. So it doesn't have to be just black, white versus good, bad. It could also be vegans versus meat eaters. It could be childless people versus people with lots of babies. There are just a billion different options for what you could use the IAT idea for. Sometimes even the IAT is a better predictor of behavior than an explicit measure is. So for instance, the self-death IAT predicts suicide quite well, but it's not entirely clear what exactly the IAT measures. So what it does show us is that the ease by which a stimulus A and B can be linked to the categories X and Y, right? So how can the stimuli Shanice and Mark be linked to the categories good and bad? The effect, however, is critically dependent on the valence of the stimuli. So, for instance, on how nice the names are. How nice do you think the name Shanice versus Mark is? And also it depends on perhaps how many Shanices or Latoyas or Marks or Debbies you know. So in a way, you could say that the IAT reflects both the attitudes towards the category and also towards the stimuli. So it's not the case that it's a pure reflection of people's attitudes, but it also necessarily captures some reactions of our participants when they take the IAT to the specific stimuli that are being used. So if we wanted to summarize some criticism about measures of implicit attitudes, well, we could ask two questions. First, we could ask whether they actually show us the participant's true self. So what they show us is the response that someone has when their conscious self-presentation is hindered. So what you do when you're not entirely in control, when you're not super in charge, when you're not super paying attention to what you're doing. And now this depends whether you think that this is someone's true self, kind of depends on your answer to the question of whether people reveal their true self for when they're actually drunk, or when they are tired, or when they're exhausted because they have so much other stuff going on in their mind. So do you think that people's true self is the self that they show when they aren't presenting themselves, or do you think that the presentation is actually also part of who we are? So someone might display implicit racism in terms of the IAT score, but they might actually never act in a racist way because they still have a conscious ability to override their let's call it intuition. So it's difficult to say whether our IAT score actually tells us more about the truth and the true self of someone who takes the score than other measures of their attitudes might. This is one piece of criticism that we could voice about these implicit measures. A second type of criticism could be that it's unclear if they actually do present us with an opportunity to look at the unconscious, the intuitive mind, because the correlation between implicit and explicit measures is actually generally low, right? I've already pointed out that it's not necessarily the case that our implicit IAT actually predicts how someone would describe themselves. So if I ask someone if they're a racist and I compare that with the implicit measure, that doesn't necessarily have to correlate. But this could be because of many reasons, and it could be even that both are weak measures. It could be that neither direct nor our implicit measures actually work well. Just to bring home this point that the mean correlation between explicit and implicit measures is low. Here I'm going to post the link or the name of the study below. Here is some data. So this suggests that actually the link between explicit measures and implicit measures is actually it's pretty low at a correlation of 0.24. But we don't know exactly why it is that low, right? It might just be that both of them don't really exactly measure what we're interested in. So, okay, also the IAT doesn't really solve our measurement problem for attitudes. Is there another thing that we could use to try to gauge whether people hold prejudiced attitudes and if perhaps they're even racist? There's one last attempt that I want to show you, which would be closer to measuring people's behavior. Instead of asking them to only categorize items, here participants basically play a type of video game almost. So the idea of studying shooter bias is to sort of circumvent some of the problems of explicit attitude measures and implicit attitude measures, and instead going with like a behavioral version. So participants take part in a simulation where they experience what it's like to be a police officer. It's a computerized shooting game where there are 20 different backgrounds and 80 different images of men who are either black or white. And participants are given money as an incentive to perform well. And what is their task? Well, they're shown some kind of a background, and then in each trial, a series of empty backgrounds are shown. It's basically like a slideshow that these pictures go by, and then at some point a shooter shows up, and this person either is a black or a white person, and they either hold a gun or they hold some other object. So it could be a water bottle, for instance. And our participants are vigilant, of course. They're told that their job is to shoot these people if they hold a gun. But they're also supposed to not to make few mistakes, right? So we can take a look at the likelihood that they will shoot a white person who holds a gun, a black person who holds a gun, or a white person who doesn't hold a gun, and a black person who doesn't hold a gun, right? So now it becomes a signal detection problem. If you shot this black person with a gun, you might get a signal like this. It says, good shot, you get 10 points. But, and again, we show a bunch of backgrounds. If you shoot someone like this, a black person holding a phone and not a gun, then you would lose some points. So you get feedback like this. So what we can look at basically is how many errors people make, depending on whether the target shown is armed or unarmed, and if the target is black or white. Okay, so what we see here is in general that participants were more likely to shoot someone who is unarmed. Then they decided not to shoot armed targets. So they rather erred on the side of being overly active, and they weren't overly standoffish, right? So there were more false alarms basically than misses, if we want to boil it down to the language of signal detection. This tendency, however, to shoot unarmed people more than to abstain from shooting armed people was stronger when the target was African American or a black person than when the target was white. So basically there is a tendency here for more false alarms than misses among when the target person was black versus white. For the white targets, the percentage of false alarms versus real misses was approximately equal, but black targets were both less likely to get the benefit of the doubt and more likely to be shot when it was actually the case that they should have been shot. Okay, and we could take this as evidence that people hold even a behavioral bias against black people in this case. So that would be evidence for prejudice actually flowing into discrimination, into discriminatory behavior. So why would it be perhaps a good measure to use this shooter bias for studying prejudice and racism and ultimately actual discriminatory behavior? Well, the idea is that you have still less control over your responses than if I just ask you directly. So this would reduce some of the social desirability. But there's no access to your true underlying attitudes. All we have is your behavior. In addition, these ideas are still relatively new, so they need some more validation. And it's also quite possible that there's just a bit of variation in how exactly it's implemented. So for instance, I could show you 10 shooters, or I could show you 100 shooters, potential shooters. And so there's no kind of standard protocol for this so far. All right, but what remains is the question of whether perhaps stereotyping, prejudice, and so on is ultimately about behavior, so about discrimination, and if this might actually be what we're interested in. But one last consoling thought is that even though it's really hard for us to measure attitudes, it's often the case that if we use multiple explicit and implicit measures together, they kind of point us in the same direction. Therefore combining different ways of measuring the same thing might actually be the best way for now that we can try to measure attitudes, in particular with social desirability laden questions like racism. Okay, so overall, what did we do in this session? We started by defining stereotypes, then we talked a little bit about when stereotypes come to mind. And then we talked about why stereotypes come to mind. I briefly plugged the idea that stereotype threat is a thing, but I'm not giving too much away because this will be the topic of the work groups. And then we spoke a bit about measurement issues with regard to implicit measures of attitudes and prejudice. That is it. That is all for this session on stereotypes. Next up, I think we have social comparisons, and I look forward to seeing you there.